It's hard to understate the political significance of the changes that took place towards the end of the 15th and the beginning of the 16th centuries. The most significant of these changes was the increasing dominance of royal power at the expense of all other forms of social and political organisation. We can date the rise of the state as we've come to know and love it, well, perhaps love is a little strong, to this period. Almost everything we can see in the modern state is already there in embryo. Centralisation, incipient nationalism, a systematic repression or even destruction of intermediate social institutions, and a desire to domesticate and control the church. A policy that reached its apogee in the post-Reformation settlement in both Catholic and Protestant states. Some things in the modern state, such as its incipient desire to exert total control over all aspects of social and political life, including the economy and the family, had to wait for the development of a sophisticated bureaucracy that didn't come into full flower until the end of the 18th century. There's more than a little irony in the rise of a form of political absolutism that was to see the severe restriction of the absolutist claims of the papacy, and which was itself merely a secular reflection of that very absolutism that had been claimed for the papacy itself. The patchwork quilt that was the late medieval political world was in part a result of the limitations of travel and communication during this period. It is not only political power and control that was local, everything was local, including commerce, law and culture. The economic changes which had been gathering force since the 12th century began to take significant effect during this period and saw the development of international trade and banking, together with the emergence of a new merchant middle class that was neither noble nor peasant, neither clerical nor royal. Kings with absolutist ambitions and merchants with commercial ambitions made common cause with each other to restrict and limit the power of the feudal nobility, each for their own reasons. Kings needed money for their armies and for the disarming and political neutralization of an independent and potentially competitive class of nobles. The merchants desired freedom from what they perceived as restrictive and arbitrary limitations to their activities deriving from local law and administration and a greater and more extensive legal certainty. Spain, as a single country, appears as if from nowhere at this time, resulting from the union of kingdoms of Aragon and Castile, and their consequent extension of control over most of the Iberian Peninsula. So used are we to looking at the maps of Europe and seeing Spain occupying the bulk of Iberia that it takes an effort of imagination to realise how recent a reality this is. Absolutism in England dates from the conclusion of the War of the Roses, and the accession, the very dubious accession, of the Tudors under Henry VII. From this time on, the great families of England, the Stanleys, who were key to Henry's successful effort to acquire the throne at the Battle of Bosworth Field, the Nevilles, the Percys and such like, changed from quasi-independent rulers of their own regions to become mere courtiers whose position and power depends ultimately upon royal favour. By far the earliest instance of the development of royal absolutism and centralisation is to be found in France as early as the first third of the 15th century. The French king acquired control of the nation's non-feudal and increasingly professional military force, together with the authority to impose taxation to pay for it. By the beginning of the 16th century, the great quasi-independent regions of Brittany, Burgundy and later Lorraine had become mere regions of a united France. The political, social and cultural particularism of the emergent nation-states in the context of an increasingly chaotic and feeble empire provided new material for political thought and reflection. These new absolute or soon-to-be absolute monarchs needed a dignity and style that would elevate them above their increasingly subservient and powerless courtiers. It is no accident that a new style of address, Your Majesty, was adopted at this time, first by the Emperor Charles V and then by King Francis I of France and King Henry VIII of England. The reality corresponding to this majestas was embodied in clothes, music, buildings, art and elaborate etiquette. This is the time and these are the circumstances into which Machiavelli was born in 1469. If it is a truism that every man is a creature of his time, this is no less true of Machiavelli than of any other thinker. Born into an Italy riven by semi-permanent strife between the major city-states of Florence, Venice, Naples, Milan, and notoriously the Papal States, stretching right across the belly of the Italian peninsula, all of these city-states being the object of strategic plans of occupation and control by the newly centralised Spain, France, and the not yet centralised German Empire. How could his view of politics and political philosophy not be affected by his political experience? Machiavelli's early career culminated in his appointment as a kind of minister without portfolio of the Florentine Republic, commissioned to go on diplomatic missions to various other states, including the Papal States, France, and Germany. The Medici family came to power when the Republic collapsed in 1512 as the result of complicated manoeuvres by Spain against France, whereupon Machiavelli was accused of conspiring against the Medici interests, not only losing his job, but even undergoing torture and imprisonment. The two works treated in this lecture were written shortly after this devastating personal experience, while Machiavelli was in internal exile and bear the marks of this experience in every line. Keenly aware and envious of the newly minted politically united realms of France and Spain, inchoately desirous of a similar outcome for Italy as a whole, see his passionate appeal to Lorenzo de' Medici in the final chapter of The Prince. Machiavelli, like Marsilius of Padua before him, was resentful of what he took to be the chief obstacle to that unity, the Papal State. Too strong to be shifted from its central and obstructive position, yet not strong enough to be the basis of unification, the Papal State is blamed by Machiavelli for most of Italy's woes. To test the truth of this claim, Machiavelli asks us to conduct a thought experiment. He writes, "And anyone to be promptly convinced by experiment of the truth of all this should have the power to transport the court of Rome to reside with all the power it has in Italy in the midst of the Swiss, who of all peoples nowadays live most according to their ancient customs so far as religion and their military system are concerned. And he would see in a very little while that the evil habits of that court would create more confusion in that country than anything else that could ever happen there." Other than resenting the machinations of the Pope as one among many Italian rulers, Machiavelli was singularly blind to the significance of religion and its possible political effects in general. Given that he died in 1527, in the very year that the Medicis were expelled from Florence, and just 10 years after Luther posted his theses to the door of the castle church at Wittenberg, it is perhaps too much to expect that he should have anticipated what was about to happen in Europe in the 120 years after his death. On the other hand, because of his unique experience of the depravity, cruelty, and futility of the intra-Italian wars, no other thinker of the period gave expression to the naked reality of the acquisition and deployment of power in any comparable way. Was Machiavelli a Christian? In The Prince we find little or no explicit mention of Christianity, except when piety is picked out as a virtue worthy of simulation. Religion is considered of value only insofar as its practice is conducive to good behaviour by the public at large, but it is not allowed to be a restraint on the actions of the prince. As Napoleon is alleged to have said, religion is excellent stuff for keeping common people quiet, and religion is what keeps the poor from murdering the rich. As against this, we find nothing of the idea of natural law, a commonplace of medieval thought, no reference to the fathers of the Church or the saints or to Scripture, and above all, no effort to place politics within a larger religious or theological context. Furthermore, Machiavelli directly attacked Christianity for, as he saw it, promoting servility and weakness. In this respect, Machiavelli anticipates Nietzsche, as in other respects he anticipates Hobbes. All in all, Machiavelli is best understood as one of the earliest of the new humanists of the movement that would come to be called the Renaissance. Some would hold that the Renaissance humanists as a whole were not so much anti-Christian as simply a Christian. For example, MacLelland writes, Machiavelli is probably a Christian about everything important except politics. But I don't see how this can be. Being a Christian doesn't really allow one to pick and choose as one likes, and to leave the whole of politics out of the Christian dispensation is to excise a major chunk of human activity. Machiavelli never refers to Aristotle, which is very significant when you consider that, as George Sabine notes, until the 16th century it was scarcely possible to write a treatise on politics which did not owe a debt to Aristotle's Politics. Machiavelli also rejected the classical and Aristotelian idea of the polis as a natural entity with a common set of ends binding all its members together. For him, the state was an arena of competing interests that had to be resolved in such a way that the existence of the state itself was not subverted. The task of the prince was to blend these competing interests together dynamically, as Machiavelli thought the competing interests of the Senate and the Roman people had been blended together in the early Roman Republic. Machiavelli thinks that the success of Rome in its republican phase was predicated on the incorporation of liberty in large measure into its public proceedings. Unusually, however, he does not believe that this liberty arose from some fundamental identity of purpose among the various groups in Roman society. On the contrary, he believes that it was the fundamental underlying tensions between the Senate and the people, between the patricians and the plebs, that created the space for liberty by preventing the dominance and hence the tyrannical rule of either group. He writes, "I maintain that those who blame the quarrels of the Senate and the people of Rome condemn that which was the very origin of liberty, and that they were probably more impressed by the cries and noise which these disturbances occasioned in the public places than by the good effect which they produced, and that they do not consider that in every republic there are two parties, that of the nobles and that of the people, and all the laws that are favourable to liberty result from the opposition of these parties to each other, as may easily be seen from the events that occurred in Rome." This idea is somewhat similar to Plato's image in The Statesman of the ruler as a kind of weaver, whose role it is to blend the disparate elements in the state into a dynamically stable whole. In recognizing the creative power of competition in the public arena and its contribution to liberty, Machiavelli distinguished himself from the bulk of his predecessors and contemporaries, and anticipates a theme that will scarcely receive recognition again until the development of economics as an independent science some 300 years into the future. His recognition of the creativity of competition is not the only instance in which Machiavelli gives evidence of his prescience. He also recognized very clearly that once a people has lost its liberty by coming under princely government, it is no simple matter to recover it. He writes, "Many examples in ancient history prove how difficult it is for a people that have been accustomed to live under the government of a prince to preserve its liberty, if by some accident it has recovered it, as was the case with Rome after the expulsion of the Tarquins. And this difficulty is a reasonable one, for such a people may well be compared to some wild animal which, although by nature ferocious and savage, has been, as it were, subdued by having been always kept imprisoned and in servitude, and being let out into the open fields, not knowing how to provide food and shelter for itself, becomes an easy prey to the first one who attempts to chain it up again. The same thing happens to a people that has not been accustomed to self-government. For, ignorant of all public affairs, of all means of defence or offence, neither knowing the princes or being known by them, it soon relapses under a yoke oftentimes much heavier than the one which it has but just shaken off. This difficulty occurs even when the body of the people is not wholly corrupt. But when corruption has taken possession of the whole people, then it cannot preserve its free condition even for the shortest possible time, as we shall see further on. And therefore our argument has reference to a people where corruption has not yet become general, and where the good still prevails over the bad. Civic culture, including the ability to exercise liberty, is not something that can be conjured from nowhere. It is a delicate plant that, once crushed, requires tender loving care if it is to revive and flourish. It is not sufficient, as some think, simply to install democratic procedures and institutions in such countries, and expect them to work in the absence of the historical and cultural supports that are a necessary condition of their ability to function elsewhere. As Machiavelli remarks in the Discourses, a corrupt people that becomes free can with greatest difficulty maintain its liberty. Despite the Republican sympathies he displays in the Discourses, Machiavelli is unambiguous in contending that if radical change is needed in any political structure, it can be effected only by one single individual. He writes, "It never or rarely happens that a republic or monarchy is well constituted or its old institutions entirely reformed, unless it is done by only one individual. It is even necessary that he whose mind has conceived such a constitution should be alone in carrying it into effect. A sagacious legislator of a republic, therefore, whose object is to promote the public good and not his private interests, and who prefers his country to his own successors, should concentrate all authority in himself. And the wise mind will never censure anyone for having employed any extraordinary means for the purpose of establishing a kingdom or constituting a republic." Machiavelli redefined the very idea of virtue, so that instead of its being synonymous with prudence and wisdom, as would have been the traditional understanding of the term, it is now taken to be descriptive of a collection of practical skills, such as courage and energy and willpower, not to mention shrewdness and cunning. Along with the radically refined virtù, the idea of fortuna plays a significant role in Machiavelli's thought. Fortuna is not simply a dramatic personification of Christian providence, an idea of which we find no mention in Machiavelli, but a return of the pagan and capricious goddess who may or may not reward the man of virtù. Understood non-metaphorically, fortuna appears to be a way of describing the world of change, contingency and accident, which spreads itself out in front of Machiavelli's eyes, which is not as such a world that is recognizably Christian or the subject of a beneficent providence. In a striking image, Machiavelli compares Fortuna to a swollen river which, in its fury, overflows the plains, tears up the trees and buildings, and sweeps the earth from one place and deposits it in another. Everyone flies before the flood, and yields to its fury, unable to resist it. And notwithstanding this state of affairs, men do not, when the river is in its ordinary condition, provide against its overflow by dikes and malls, so that when it rises it may flow either in the channel thus provided for it, or that at any rate its violence may not be entirely unchecked, nor its effects prove so injurious. It is the same with Fortune, who displays her power where there is no organized valour to resist her, and where she knows that there are no dikes or walls to control her. Machiavelli's attitude to Fortuna is a kind of qualified fatalism. While he is inclined to agree with those who think there is no point in resisting the decrees of fate, in the end he thinks that even though the major movement of events is outside our control, we can still, to a small extent, determine their direction within severe limits.